On this episode of Attention Elsewhere, we are talking about Heaven Will Be Mine by Pillow Fight Games and Worst Girl Games.
Truly is about the worst of girls.
But because I picked this piece of media, it's your turn to summarize it.
So, Heaven Will Be Mine is a visual novel that is very in line with the mecha genre of big fighting ships in space. However, unlike a lot of sci fi, it's not set during the far flung future, but rather in an alternate history. It's set roughly during the 1980s, during the Cold War. And this part I'm a little fuzzy on, so you'll have to correct me when I'm done with my summary. But I believe what occurs is that humanity and the Earth was preoccupied with the real, actual Cold War, and then they discovered an existential threat from space, literally termed existential threat, and they put the Cold War on pause in order to send a whole bunch of unwanted kids to space as a part of this official space program to get them prepared to occupy big fighting robots called ship selves in order to obliterate the existential threat. However, the existential threat was obliterated instantly, leaving a whole bunch of kids trained for war up in space, as well as their adult mentor figures, just sort of hanging out, not quite sure what to do next. And it's what to do next that is the main conflict of this game. After the existential threat was obliterated, the program split into three factions, each of which has a main character that players can choose to follow their route. Each faction has a very different opinion about what to do next. There is the Memorial Foundation that wants to return to Earth, but they know that Earth is probably not going to welcome them with open arms, and so in order to get into their good graces, they want to defeat the other two factions and possibly drag what remains of those factions back with them to Earth. And the character associated with the Memorial Foundation is a character called Lunatera, who was originally a member of another faction but betrayed them for the Memorial Foundation, who is a really cold, stoic figure who's actually just really an indecisive person. On the completely opposite end of the spectrum is the faction Cradle's Graces that wants nothing to do with Earth and wants to further delve into the recesses of space and create a human community out in space, severed from Earth. The character associated with that faction is Pluto, who is one of the most formidable members of the original space program and who pilots the biggest, most impressive, most dangerous ship self. And then you have the last faction, which is just off the spectrum, called the Celestial Mechanics, who took a tiny little accusation from Earth, a little theory that the children in space could be considered not quite fully human. And the Celestial Mechanics' response to that theory was bet. They really want to actually just become aliens and sever themselves not from Earth, but also from the human species at large. And the character associated with this faction is a character named Saturn, who can best be described as a brat who does not punctuate her sentences, whose true motives are pretty ambiguous in relation to her faction's goals. She really, really hates the faction leader, but whether or not she's on board with the goals of that faction is not apparent until you reach her ending. The actual gameplay sees you pick one of these three characters to follow. Through a series of chapters, you engage in missions with the other two characters, but only one at a time. So there's two missions per, I guess you could say per chapter. It's actually a little messier than that, but let me simplify. It's two missions per chapter, each one corresponding to the other two characters that you have not decided to play. And in each mission, you make a choice that pours loyalty points into one of the factions, either your own faction that you choose to stay loyal to, or the other faction that you are betraying your faction for. In between each mission, there's this screen where you can actually see how much loyalty you have towards each faction. So this is not a secret. This math is on display for you to view between every mission. And whichever faction you have the most loyalty towards is the ending you get. And this was incredibly confusing when I first played the game because it's not so much that you play for a character's ending, you play for a faction's ending. And each faction ending is from the perspective of the character associated with the faction. Not the player character, but the character associated with the faction. So, for example, I played Saturn's route first, betrayed the celestial mechanics for Cradle's Graces, and was super confused when the Cradle's Graces ending hit my screen from Pluto's perspective. I am skipping over a whole bunch of details, but that is the gist of Heaven Will Be Mine. Alistair, what did I miss?
Your description of Cradle's Graces is not quite right. Insofar as they are interested in Earth, but only in desiring to actually pull Earth into space with them. So that it's not that they don't want anything to do with it, they want Earth in space with them.
I had thought that they had originally wanted nothing to do with Earth, to sever themselves from it, but then Pluto decided to instead become a sort of lure for other people to follow and chase after. Because this is a feature of every single ending, the player character in some way betrays their faction's goals, philosophies, theories, and some more dramatically than others. So I had read Pluto's ending and her decision to escape into the stars and basically initiate a merry chase between her and whoever chases after them from Earth. I had read that as a betrayal of the faction's original motives, which was to just fuck off into space and sever themselves. But then again, this game is really dense. There's a lot of text to read through. It's entirely possible that I've misread everything about this game.
I'm mostly remembering it from Pluto's actual ending, which is sort of a forever war. So I think you might be right. The one other thing that I noticed that you skipped over were two of the most important terms in this game, and those are culture and gravity.
Skipped that by design, because then I'd have to explain it.
Well, in the interest of putting us sort of ahead of the rest of the things that we want to discuss, I'm going to open with what is culture, at least as it is defined by Heaven Will Be Mine.
Did I mention that this is a really dense game with a lot of text? And that might not be praise. I think I mean that critically. This game's text and dialogue really likes to talk in circles and define and redefine and overdefine terms in slightly different words every single time, which makes it really hard to pin down precisely what anything means.
Actually, do you want to start with gravity or do you want to start with culture? They are used interchangeably.
Yeah, a lot of words are used interchangeably. But anyway, to actually answer your question, yeah, what's gravity? So this is going to be a really stupid definition, but I did my best. Heaven Will Be Mine defines gravity as the thing which draws other things together.
Newton would be proud.
I know. But in this game, literally everything from planets, solar systems, human communities, even the individual chemical makeup of a human is held together by gravity. Without which, the thing is scattered thinly until there is nothing left of them to recognize or touch. Still exists, but the human perspective cannot recognize the thing anymore, nor can it touch it, and therefore to humans, the thing no longer exists. So gravity is a prerequisite for human existence. Culture is one of those things which is subject to gravity, and it is probably most akin to gravity in this game. Culture, I think, can be defined as how most people would define it: a collection of shared beliefs, goals, actions within the community, a shared environment, all of which are distinct from an other. A culture cannot exist without a thing to define itself against. In Heaven Will Be Mine, culture seems just as inescapable and inevitable as gravity. It seems to be this natural, unstoppable force that humans cannot control, and by which they are controlled. And for some, this is not comforting. This is imprisoning. Culture is like a chain. These shared beliefs, goals, actions, shared environment are too restrictive, especially to the characters in space, who are no longer within the literal gravity of Earth, within the culture of Earth. This game implies that to escape culture, one must sever the connection between oneself and that culture, much like escaping the gravity of a planet. Would it be fair to say that this game is all about the final escape from Earth? Because this tripped me up in the beginning. I had originally thought that this game was being subtly ironic about the purpose of the conflict. And I'm not going to tell you what I think. I want to know what you think first, in case I'm wrong, so that I can pivot and change my answer. Why are they fighting in space? Especially in the absence of the existential threat, which was obliterated so easily. That's why they're originally there, yes. But like, why are they still there? And why are the factions fighting each other?
There's a few reasons. The first is potential futures. Each of the factions, initially at least, saw a potentiality in space for creating something new. That or replicating Earth's culture over the rest of the solar system. And this is something that we see with the various planets we visit, specifically, I think, Mars, in which they've already started terraforming, but that terraforming project has sort of come to a stop. So I think there is a fighting for lost futures would be the first part of it. And there's also the maybe bigger component, which is that by leaving Earth, they have become something other than Earth. There's no real return for them. Even for the one ending Lunaterra's faction is called Memorial Foundation. They sort of desire it out of a failure of future.
The characters, they're not united in their otherness. Where they diverge is in what kind of other identity they want to develop. And this is what I got tripped up over. I had assumed that it was totally possible for these factions to just go their separate ways and live out their merry lives without bothering each other. That's not actually true. I guess I had just failed to read the opening text because I went back and I read the opening text narration. The reason they're all fighting each other is to gain control of something called the gravity well, which I suppose determines Earth's access to space. The implication being that if they don't gain control of the gravity well and figure out what they want to do with themselves in space, Earth will come to space and make the decision for them. So even though they're all fighting each other, the actual antagonist haunting the narrative is Earth.
We never get a clear view of Earth as a culture, although it's described sort of homogeneously. It is specifically defined through how they wage war, as distinct from the various factions in space. It's in one of the endings, I think it's the Memorial Foundation ending, in which we are told Memorial Foundation have experience in numbers, and that still matters. It matters the most because the gravity well is whimpering, sputtering, and Earth's tactics, strategic and realistic, are favored. Their weapons are kinetic. They don't fight like with anything dreamlike or unique. All they have is to do this simple job. A fight between giant robots can only be so realistic, but that's the best they know how to do. They've never fought on Earth after all.
One of the reasons why we could argue that these factions are all other, even though the Memorial Foundation actually just wants to return to Earth. Like, they don't see themselves as being distinctly other. They are, or at least the pilots, like Lunaterra, are, because of what they had to go through to exist in space, period, but exist in space in a way that they could originally fight the existential threat in a way that is fundamentally different from how humans fight each other in a kind of human favorable environment like Earth. In order to fight the existential threat, the characters have to occupy big fighting giant robots called ship elves, which are, I think, incidentally designed not to hurt each other. So when these characters are in their ship elves, they can literally shoot each other, and those shots can hit, and they won't die. It's a war with no casualties, at least as long as they're fighting each other. In Pluto's ending, the further and further away Pluto's forces get away from Earth, and the farther and farther away Earth's forces chase them into space, the more and more Earth's forces have to fight on Pluto's terms because space is not an environment that will support the kinetic fighting. As the human forces change their ways of combat, they fundamentally change as a species, as a culture, and many of them just stick around. They just stay in
They
space.
become other.
Yes. And the irony is that they had to become other in order to connect with an enemy, with the other.
And it's not exactly incidental that the ship selves are designed in this way either. There's a character that we only see sort of in passing through bits of theory and the occasional conversation with Pluto, I think, called Dr. Nix, who's the one that designed the ship selves. And she very specifically designed them to take after toys, like children's toys, rather than as weapons of war. They still bear the hallmarks of it. One of the things that I find maybe most interesting is Luna Terra's ship self was initially outfitted with kinetic weapons. It's something that's mentioned like really briefly in the boot up sequence, like right before her route starts, is that all of its rounds of kinetic weaponry are depleted, and that now it only has access to whatever they call sort of like the dreamlike weapons, i.e., lasers and talons that have.
Poison and actual literal gravity.
Yeah, but this idea that the ship selves were never designed or took on this role as not being designed as weapons so much as a way to mediate conflict between pilots and factions in a way that doesn't rob pilots of futures. There's no death. And so it takes on the shape of like children playing with their toys. That's what space is. Space is a sandbox on which these children to play and write and create. And while there are certainly like emotional consequences, but especially Lunaterra seems to have a habit of breaking people's hearts, though I think maybe that's all of them actually. While there's emotional consequence, there's never a physical end. There is never a point where these pilots are no longer able to interact with each other. I think that's maybe the biggest opposition to Earth. I think Lunaterra at one stage mentions that Earth's drones kill in the most boring way possible, which is putting a lance through your cockpit and just killing you outright. There's no future. And that is also maybe why her mech still bears a wound. This is a question that I had that I was like kind of stuck on is like Luna Terra's mech has a wound that has never healed, which is peculiar because all of these mechs are self-healing.
To the best of my understanding, that wound is a manifestation of her psyche and not obtained by an actual blow, because I could not find any mention of like a real battle or anything.
I think I actually know where that's from. Luna Terra is the only one that has fought one of Earth's drones before. So I have to wonder, not only is it sort of a manifestation of her psyche, but is it also a wound left over from that initial fight with a kinetic force? Is that a marking of Earth?
If so, it has an interesting implication for her character, since she seems to be the only one of the three who has personal experience with the threat of Earth. Furthermore, she's the only character who was born on Earth, and to my understanding, grew up on Earth because there's a text correspondence between her and somebody who I think was recruiting children for this program. And the way that she speaks in this transcription is not like a child at all. Like she seems like a fully formed, developed human being at that point. Between the three characters, she's the only one who has intimate experience with Earth and with its violence. And yet, she is the character associated with the Memorial Foundation that wants to return to Earth. Now, her ending sees her betray, surprise, surprise, the Memorial Foundation. What she essentially does is she terraforms the moon, which becomes like another Earth that is within full view of Earth. So Earth and the moon are in full view of each other. They're just staring each other in the face for the rest of eternity, aware of each other's existence, but unable to cross the boundary.
Didn't pick up on the bit of them not being able to sort of connect with each other. My assumption, I suppose, had been that Earth and the moon existed semi harmoniously, but I'm not so sure anymore. Because she and the trio are living on the moon at the end.
Yes. I could be misrepresenting that ending because it's from Lunaterra's perspective, regardless of which player you decide to play as. If you align with the Memorial Foundation, you will get that ending from Lunaterra's perspective. And Lunaterra is very spiteful about her relationship with Earth. So the way that she had framed the relationship was as one where the two halves of humanity, one occupying Earth, one occupying the moon, would always be staring at each other and always be reminded of each other, like intimately reminded of each other's existence, but distant.
But still culturally similar.
Functionally the same.
And the ship selves are lost. Part of her ending is sort of giving up the toys because the moon is now sort of a second Earth. They are also not able to be used on it.
I want to return to the language of toys and warfare, especially in light of other mecha entertainment media. Now, I'm not an expert, but I do know that a lot of mecha media, in some part, exists, in other part, fuels the toy making industry. These mecha robots in anime, in Western cartoons, were designed to make them very easy to sell to children. And I think that Heaven Will Be Mine is a little smarter than this. I don't think that they're just trying to nod to that history by calling the ship selves toys.
I read it less as a nod to that and more as a recognition of what separates our characters from their surroundings and specifically from Earth. My reading of combat in space takes sort of the shape of children at play, and part of this is because the ship selves are spoken of as toys, and those are toys for the children, or in this case, our pilots, who are now grown up. But I think at the time that they were sort of indoctrinated into or pulled into space, they were either born in space, or in Luna Terra's case, she was probably a teenager, though we don't know. I read a lot of this as designing a space in which children can play. So all of the scientists and all of the various leaders and such seem to have created this space in which play is important. And what Heaven Will Be Mine seems to suggest is that that element of play is lost, or at least like lessened, as we become adults. As we become adults, our actions have lasting consequences, both physically and emotionally. And at least within the context of Heaven Will Be Mine, it feels like that closes off potential futures. I don't know if it's quite as hard as and fast as that. I don't think adults and children are defined as entirely separate from each other within Heaven Will Be Mine. But I think children have that ability to imagine things that previous generations cannot. And so when it comes to toys and war, this is a space in which our protagonists can play. They can play at consequence, they can play at risk, but they'll never be necessarily threatened or harmed unless, of course, they come into conflict with Earth. So space is a place of possibility. It is this like vast unknown landscape on which these children can leave their marks.
A previously inhabited landscape. Let's not think about the indigenous species of space too hard.
Yep.
I don't really want to take us there. We'll get there. Put a pin in that. But I think this game really likes to take things both literally and figuratively, and the question of toys and warfare is one of those subjects which it takes literally and figuratively. I think you've covered the figurative really well, but I took this game a lot more literally than I think it wanted me to. And I was thinking about the literal implications of treating warfare like playing. Many military leaders in the real world who are not the soldiers on the ground treat warfare like a game. You don't have to look too hard at a strategy board and compare it to
Yeah.
games. War has been compared to chess. Those at the highest level of military organizations can treat war like a game, like positioning toys against each other. And in Heaven Will Be Mine, what's interesting is that these foot soldiers are kind of like toys. They won't die. There are no violent consequences to following the orders of the generals, which are the mentor figures in each faction.
Yeah, you can smash them together and nothing will come of it, or at least nothing as profound as death.
Which you would think would render the conflict pointless, but it's not. There are real stakes to who wins this, but whoever wins gets to drag the others with them. Winning the conflict is not won in the traditionally understood manner of warfare. And by traditional, I mean fictional. Fiction has this tendency to portray war as a fight wherein the victory conditions is the obliteration of the enemy. That's not really how war works. It's how it can work. That's why we get this little thing called genocide in pretty much every single war that's ever occurred. But genocide doesn't really work. It's kind of impossible to just obliterate an entire population in a short span of time, in a span of time as short as a war. Even the long, like some of the longest wars, like that's still a pretty short amount of time to obliterate an entire population and its culture.
Yeah, I mean you can do irreparable damage, but actually wiping out everyone is
Yeah, so those victory conditions are impossible to meet. And Heaven Will Be Mine is not concerned with that victory condition. This is a game about war wherein the victory condition is not the same as so many other fictions about war love to echo. What are the victory conditions in Heaven Will Be Mine? It's like, I guess, twisting the arm of the rest of humanity in space to join forces and unite. Because the actual enemy over there is going to fuck us over if we don't unite.
so I think this is where it being set during the Cold War feels really important. And I want to get your thoughts on like why does Heaven Will Be Mine evoke the Cold War if it's not sort of like literally set in the Cold War that we know? Like this is a fictitious take on it, obviously, and one that took us into space with like mechs and colonizing
And
and
lesbians,
lesbians.
which didn't exist back then. Sarcasm, people, sarcasm.
So how does the Cold War fit into this?
I need to disclaim that I am not and never will be an expert on the Cold War. So those fanatics out there, you know who you are, who are Cold War experts. I will say something categorically wrong, but I will do my best to make my bullshit sound convincing. So without further ado, my answer. Why? Why the 1980s? Why the Cold War? Why is it deliberately evoked in this game, both in its context but also referenced by other characters in text as like a thing that they missed or a thing that like kind of haunts them? Out of all of the famous wars within recent history, with a bunch of historical research done on it to reference, like from a creator's point of view, the Cold War is the obvious choice to reference if I were to take a real war to take inspiration from. Because in theory, the Cold War was a war without casualties. It was instead a clash of cultures, not armies. But it was also a war for global dominance, wherein whoever, I guess, quote unquote, wins is the one that extends their nation's dominance across the globe. So, like, other smaller nations had stakes in the outcome of this Cold War, but, like, in the grand scheme of things, were powerless to completely influence the outcome because this is a Cold War between two superpowers. And I mean, I could probably use the same language to describe Heaven Will Be Mine. Earth wants a real war, but the war that the factions are fighting is functionally a Cold War in that it's a clash of their cultural ideals with the victory conditions, or not so much the conditions, the outcome being that they subsume the other factions into their own or whatever version of their own faction. Like Lunaterra actually just betrays her faction's ideals, but they're not that far off. She wants to go back to Earth, but it's an Earth that is not an Earth, and she pulls the other characters into this dream and presumably the rest of humanity in space. It's the existence of Earth that really throws me off. It's also the existential threat really throws me off, is because Earth wants a real war. So where does Earth fit into this metaphor? And then what about the existential threat, which is the thing that I think, if I'm reading this correctly, ended the actual Cold War in this game's canon by forcing everybody to unite and yeet all of their unwanted children into space to fight the existential threat, which crumbled like a wet paper bag. These two entities disturb my theory. Save me, Alistair.
I mean, do they? The Earth and the existential threat, and this is pre-existential threat is suddenly immediately defeated, seem almost representative of the superpowers themselves, i.e., in this case, like US and Russia. Here we have Earth and the existential threat, and then the factions that splinter from, like, splinter off of Earth. Mm. But those factions only come into existence after the existential threat is destroyed.
Rhetorically asking, is this also some kind of metaphor for colonization, but an extremely tone deaf one? Because who are the colonizers here? Who are propagating Earth's demonstrated in-game colonial efforts through their attempted terraforming of other planets, and their obliteration of the what we could consider the indigenous species of space, and our main characters being the agents of that project or like part of that project. What do we do with that?
I want to back us up for a second to what exactly the existential threat is.
Return to your teenage self for a moment and just channel that. Now, what is the existential threat?
It's a potential future. The existential threat isn't aliens. As far as I can tell, and this is going off of what we're given by various characters who saw the existential threat, including Pluto, who ostensibly destroyed it, is that the
Yeah, like instantly.
yeah, pretty much like accidentally. Is that the existential threat was merely a different future for humanity. It was a different, like, it was a shadow or a reflection of us that was created by us entering space. This is where it becomes sort of a challenge to define it because it's not a literal thing, I think. It's merely another possibility or another countercultural movement that was destroyed by something that Pluto did.
I agree and disagree
Woo!
because there's no good definition for the existential threat. The best that we have in game are theories from other characters. I think probably Dr. Nix.
Yeah.
The reigning theory that I remember is the one that you just mentioned, which is that the existential threats, like the ripples of human activity throughout space time, unanchored by gravity. However, I do think that the existential threat does physically exist because of a few lines. The existential threat not only was weak, but is weak. It's not completely gone, it's just inconsequential. It's so weak that children with like laser pointers on Earth can point them up at space and just poof, there goes Another existential threat, which was an example of how the space program was complete overkill. Also, it is heavily implied that another character, who I believe was another child or maybe a staff member of the program, functionally committed suicide by jumping into a thing. Maybe it was the gravity
Yeah,
well,
it was the gravity well. Yeah.
and then ceased to exist. No body. The reigning theory was that their gravity was dispersed so thinly that they were functionally no longer human, and whether or not they died or became something else or even went somewhere else was a complete mystery. And it was a mystery that the characters in the audience kind of have to sit with.
Did the existential threat exist prior to the space program, or did the space program sort of incidentally create the existential threat?
Forgive me while I scroll all the way down my list of screenshots for the very beginning text. According to the Memorial Foundation, in 1980, they say, and the long and cold war where humanity united against its nemesis, an existential threat from beyond the stars, has been over for a long time. Since the 50s, we have been fighting a war against an existential threat that we cannot understand, cannot perceive, and is powerless against the technology of Earth. Blah, 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 blah. Humanity is already the undisputed authority of reality, and we have the physics to prove it.
So it's the chicken or the egg.
Yeah, let me read through the other text. To power the ship selves we made to fight the Cold War, we made tidal resonators to bring the gravity necessary for humans and culture to survive in space. While the kids are fighting, Earth is getting ready to list the humans remaining in space as part of the existential threat, and when they do, they'll send real weapons and end this war fought with plastic toys. Their justification: we are technically less than 100% human, just not human enough to be something else. That doesn't answer the
No, it
question, it
doesn't.
just begs more.
I remember the scene of, I think it's a fellow pilot jumps or goes into the gravity well and is ostensibly obliterated. And that reads to me as maybe the start of the existential threat was not, it wasn't something that was there before, but it was something that by virtue of entering space we created, and that became an easy unifier for Earth. Because like the actual shape and configuration of the existential threat doesn't really matter so long as it is something other than Earth for Earth to root against. And that's why in certain routes and certain bits of conversations we see Earth is attempting to reframe the space race, all three factions, as a new existential threat to wage war upon.
Perhaps implying that conflict is fundamental to Earthian humanity. Perhaps fundamental to Earthian, or well, space humanity, but maybe the endings disagree.
I'm hoping that this takes us somewhere. I have a bit of one of the text logs from Dr. Nix, in which she states, we believed in the Academy students and we were patient with them and gave them an environment physically, culturally, gravitationally as free from Earth's gravity as we could realistically grant them. They knew what to do much better than we did. Pluto, more than any other student, because Pluto had so much to change. If she and her power fascinate you so much, you should remember the only reason she has it at all is because she was free from you. As they grew up, they made space the future we were dreaming of. And before I knew it, I couldn't think of a single reason why we should give space back to you. Does that give us direction or does that confuse us more?
Rather confuses me. Because the answer I'm hunting for is, why does the space program exist? Did they encounter the existential threat in space after the program had already been created? Did they create the space program to fight the existential threat? Were they already fighting an existential threat that was actually just total bullshit, and then whoops, they found a real one? I don't know. All that I know is that humanity united over the fight against the existential threat. And so if you yeet a bunch of unwanted children into space with the express purpose of creating another existential threat to keep humanity on Earth united so that they don't fight each other and kill each other because you can die on Earth. Was that the game plan?
I don't know if we're gonna find the actual texts that support this, but I actually that feels like the most realistic answer is that Earth went out of its way to create an existential threat or a new existential threat by which to retain its unified form. That feels apt, especially with the Earth that we are showing, which is one that seeks to sort of keep control and doesn't really want anyone back either. Like Memorial Foundation is sort of desperate to go back to Earth, and even they are like, the closer we get to Earth, the more likely they're gonna shoot us down.
Yeah, like we have to prove ourselves. And maybe that will work. And in light of real wartime strategy, this is a pretty useful and extremely common, and one could say even incidental, strategy of war, which is that it unites the warring culture because division leads to weakness, leads to loss, and the consequences of loss are scary enough to put aside your dissent in favor of unifying to win the war. For those wartime strategists that are conscientious of this phenomenon, it can become part of the wartime strategy at home.
I mean, what we see here, and a connection that I made almost immediately on finishing the game, was like the war on terror is essentially what Earth is doing in some ways. It's not a like one to one, but hey, look, there's the enemy. We need to all band together in order to face it. And it's not just the war on terror, but I do think that is a good demonstration of sort of how the longer this war goes on, the more sort of factionalism takes root, both in the space race and also, I'm guessing, with Earth, that we just never get enough from Earth to confirm that things are falling apart for them.
And I would argue that it's not just the war on terror. Similar to the Cold War, it's like one of the most well documented and researched quote unquote wars, quote unquote real war. Let's not dive into Iraq. Like, I read and consume a lot of nonfiction about war and the experience of like being on the ground of it, being a civilian, being a part of the military structure. And my conclusion is that like this happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like almost every single war that can be construed as a war, whether it looks like a traditional one or not, is one that enforces homogenization and squashes dissent. And it's not just a deliberate strategy, it's like a phenomenon. And it doesn't matter whether or not, in historical hindsight, that side is the quote unquote good side or quote unquote bad side. It happens all over the place. And the consequences of dissent can be brutal. But where that puts the characters of Heaven Will Be Mine, again, I struggle. Because characters can't kill each other. There's factionalism. Each ending sees one faction win out over the other, but each character also betrays their faction in some way, whether big or small. So this game likes its dissent, but it also likes its unity. But like what is the argument that Heaven Will Be Mine is trying to make about all of this? So I think it wants to have it both ways, but I don't accept that. I need an actual answer instead of paradox, please.
Uh oh, this might be time to open the big old Pandora's box, which is
Do it!
queerness and heaven will be mine. I'm not so sure if heaven will be mine cares as much about its.
It's lesbians?
No, it definitely cares about the lesbians. I don't know how much it cares about its like political situation so much as it does queerness as other. This is a text. I don't think it's a stretch to say about queerness in opposition to what Earth represents, which is a status quo or a deeply patriarchal society or something. But each of the different endings that we are given are different ways for queer identity to exist. That's the reading that at least I come to pretty naturally, which is that the three endings that we land on are Memorial Foundations is it's a return to Earth, but we exist separate but close to them. We're
Separate but equal, perhaps. Not equal,
maybe.
because the moon is better.
But yeah, there is a certain like separate but equalness to that ending. And then there is Cradle's Grace's ending. Pluto essentially pulling Earth into space with her, or at least beginning the process. We don't know how this goes really. We just see the very start of it, which is we'll keep fighting and it'll draw some of you up here and some of us will be lost and go back to Earth. But we're going to keep pulling, and at some stage you're going to have to adopt like our tactics and our identity in order to come face us. And so that feels like a sort of like slow adaptation of society through conflict. We are forcing you to come with us, basically.
Yeah, you get to assimilate, not
Yeah,
us.
exactly. And then Celestial Foundation really just goes, fuck all of you. We're leaving. Except that we're going to become the constellations, and so you will always be looking up at us.
Look but don't touch.
And so each of these does feel like a sort of like the different ways to exist. Specifically within like a queer identity is like there's the we exist in close proximity with the rest of society, but we exist as ourselves. There is the we will continue to have conflict until one side or the other is sort of sorry, this is where it gets a little Cradle's Graces especially is the one that gives me a lot of difficulty because I think Celestial Mechanics ending is very much a like we will exist as ourselves and in opposition to you, but not in a way that is like engendering conflict. Right? We will separate ourselves off. We will become our own sort of community and our own. Please jump in here and save me.
We'll get to Pluto's ending, because that was also an ending that I wrestled with, but upon wrestling, I think, no, it's actually brilliant. I'm wrong, per usual. Every outcome that you've described, every possible imagined future for a queer community in context of the heteronormative communities which chain them down, I think also can be applied to a colonized community. Three options here: return to the colonizing identity and become that thing or as close to that thing as you possibly can be, even if there will always be a gap between you and that colonizing force. To become your own thing, distinct from the colonizing force, but you're not drawing a line between yourself and colonizers. Rather, instead, if the colonizers want to stay, they get to become you instead. Or just completely cutting off your community from the colonizing community, and they're just going to have to sit with your existence but not be able to do anything about it. And I don't quite know if I want to make the argument that the queer community is the colonized community, but Heaven Will Be Mine certainly seems to draw its parallels, although I don't think this game is fully aware of its colonial undertones.
I mean, I don't think it is at all. I think it is evoking it's evoking tropes off sci-fi in a way where it's not questioning them, which is peculiar for a game that is like pretty willing to allow multiple things to exist both as metaphor and like and literal at the same time. But when it comes to colonization, there's just none of that. It feels very much to me in conversation with something like Star Trek, which was initially termed as like wagon train to the stars. It was always this thing, you know, we get the final frontier. The final frontier is space. And so it feels like it's doing that without questioning it.
Except unlike the final, quote unquote, final frontiers of Earth, if the existential threat is indeed just the shadow of humanity's future and not some kind of indigenous species, which who knows, it could totally be, but if it is not an indigenous species and space is the only final frontier that is actually just empty, what I also find interesting and perhaps the only point in this game that may suggest it is even slightly aware of its colonial undertones is the efforts to terraform other planets. The goal is not to adapt to the planet, the goal is to adapt the environment to the culture, which is a very, very colonial project. Like, usually the next step in that process is resource exploitation, but I don't see that in Heaven Will Be Mine. So it could just be that maybe somebody on the team is aware of the colonial undertones, but they know the themes of the game are queerness, so they didn't quite want to muddy that
But,
theme.
like, it does muddy it, right? Because it sort of equates trans and queer liberation to, like, settler colonialism in certain ways that make this somewhat uncomfortable.
Because if the solution is to leave physically, you can't go somewhere that doesn't already have inhabitants. And this game just conveniently sidesteps the issue by reframing what could be the only inhabitants of space, the existential threat, as actually, no, that's us. So we're free to do with it whatever we will.
Yeah, I mean, it's the great trick of not having aliens in this universe. I mean, there are aliens, but aliens is just something that humans have deemed not themselves.
So, even though Earth attempted to terraform other planets, all of those projects seem to have failed. Precisely what has led to all those projects' failure? I think there are various explanations, but the fact is that they all failed. No planet will fully support human life, even when Pluto and Lunaterra step out of their ship selves on one of the planets. Like, they don't stay there forever. It's not a place that they can just live outside of their ship selves forever. And I think the reason why is that, like, there's agriculture. There is none. There's flowers, and the flowers are very pretty, but you can't live there in the flowers. You can't eat them. I mean, you probably could. Inadvisable, though. That's besides the point. The characters, except for maybe Lunaterra and the Memorial Foundation's ending, the characters do adapt to the environment. They don't force the environment to adapt to them. Their ship selves allow them to inhabit space on space's terms. This is a study of psychology. Unfortunately, the exact term escapes me, but basically the study of how your experience of the world and like your bodily experience of the world determines your actual experience of the world and who you are. This is a branch of study that has its intersections with studies of disability and how if you're deaf, especially if you're born deaf and you never have and never will experience the world as somebody with a average level of hearing, that will completely change the way that you not only experience the world and understand it, but also how you behave in it and how you act. So, to bring it back to Heaven Will Be Mine, I think it is accurate to say that whoever inhibits a ship self is being the alien, at least whilst in the ship self, because it demands a different experience with space. In fact, Saturn, and maybe even Lunaterra, but definitely Saturn comments about how her ship self senses are more than just the five human senses, and the five human senses are on overdrive. To experience the stimuli of space and ship self is not to experience it as a human, it's to experience it as something close to alien, if not actually alien. And even Pluto comments upon her ship self being more than just an outer vessel. It's like her actual self. She says something very Tumblr-y to Lunaterra. She says, is this ship self so me
Yeah.
that you're finally willing to fight me?" You know, language aside here, that's her admission that this is a ship self she can inhabit bodily, almost like how a soul can inhabit a body.
Which is something that we see with the mech genre in general, is that the mech is as much a body for experiencing other things, be it the world, other pilots, things like that. I'm catching on something that you said, and I sort of want to bring it maybe back to it a little bit, which is disability and Heaven Will Be Mine. Because we have multiple pilots who are disabled. Yeah, it's both Lunaterra and Saturn are both like biologically or mechanically like augmented in some way to be better pilots, but it was done against their will, and it's things that they've learned to like live with. That along with like the trauma of being brought up in this way as specimens to be tested. I guess I just want your thoughts a little bit more on how Heaven Will Be Mine is maybe thinking about disability.
Mhm. I think that because this game takes place in space and context really, really matters regarding how disability is defined and understood and treated, although it is true that Saturn and Pluto are augmented, I think they were artificially created and possibly artificially aged as well because they cannot be, it's impossible. They can't be as old as Lunaterra if they were born in space and Lunaterra was like a fully fledged teenager when she went to space. So it's possible that they're actually much younger, but they look a little older and they were like artificially matured. Nevertheless, that's not the point. The point is that what constitutes as a disability matters upon the context, and if the context is space, then it is not Saturn and Pluto that are disabled or can be read as disabled, but instead Lunaterra. She doesn't have the body built for space. She's got an Earthian's body. And she's done well enough, but there's a lot of things that she can't do that Pluto and Saturn can do intuitively.
Lunaterra is not able to influence the narrative in the same way. She is not aware of space time as narrative. I'm sorry.
Thank you for taking us in this direction.
Should I issue the question? Should I put it forward?
Yeah, do it.
Why are Saturn and Pluto able to recognize space-time as narrative, i.e., they recognize the game that they're in, but not the audience that is experiencing that? What do we define this as? What do we think of it? Because it's not a fourth wall break. They're not talking to us, the audience. They're talking.
As if each other are like characters in a narrative, which they are, so that's why it feels like a fourth wall break, but technically, no, they never address the audience. Okay, first of all, Lunaterra does recognize narrative, but not nearly as well as Saturn and Pluto. She seems to recognize narrative in terms of verbs and nouns and the logistics of language, but she doesn't situate herself or any other character in a broader narrative. She's very narrowly focused on the here and the now. So, in that sense, she could also be read as disabled in that she is not as capable of recognizing the narrative, even if she can still recognize it a little bit. But it is true that Saturn and Pluto do call out the narrative a lot, although only when they're with each other.
There are sort of narrative snippets in various scenes where it's not the characters talking to each other, but simply like a description of what they're seeing. And in those bits, there are occasionally lines of text added for both of them in usually like a different colored font, to indicate either a recognition that that is being said, or sort of their own thoughts influencing it in some way.
I definitely recall the color font. Those bits of text were in context of Pluto and Saturn's missions together. Usually in a space that fucks with space time. Why? Well, I have a couple of theories. Firstly, as we've already established, Lunaterra was not born in space. She was born on Earth. Saturn and Pluto were born in space and have no intimate experience with Earth. Earth and culture and gravity and the narrative, perhaps, that culture runs on, they were born away from its culture, its gravity, its narrative. So, if any characters were able to recognize the narrative, I think it would be the characters who were not born within it. To characters like Saturn and Pluto, it's very strange. And because they recognize it as strange and unfamiliar, they can better confront it. It's one of the reasons why the perspective of an outsider can be really valuable, is because they don't take certain things for granted. They're usually better equipped to start recognizing something for what it is. Even though Pluto and Saturn are capable of this, they're only capable of recognizing narrative when they're with each other. By this logic, you would think that they'd be able to do this with other characters, other cadets of the program, because they weren't just the only two who were born and raised in space. They were part of a whole program within the space program, some of whom are supporting characters. These characters never call out the narrative together. It's only when Pluto and Saturn are with each other.
Yeah.
In the scenes that they're doing this is when we get these childish hand drawings of their past. Those hand drawings indicate that both characters had a longing to reach out and connect with other people in their childhood, that they were not able to do so when they were children, but they are currently in the present existing in a space of space-time fuckery, which could enable that blurring of the boundaries of space and time and narrative.
So I don't have a good answer, i.e., like in universe, but I have an answer for what these two represent in sort of a bigger conversation about mech. And this is specifically to do with like early Gundam and with the creator of Gundam. He's not the first to do it, but there was this feeling during the 1900s, specifically the mid to late 1900s, that by entering space, we will be irrevocably changed. And in Gundam, this takes the shape of the new types, who are these like occult figures. They have access to like telekinesis and like telepathy, and also only able to connect with each other. They're seen both as like a future for humanity, but they're also sort of locked off from the rest of humanity by virtue of only being able to like really reach out to each other, at least initially. For the purposes of this conversation, I figured it was worth grabbing a quote from the creator of Gundam, Tomino, to sort of add into this, which is talking about the original Gundam series. He said, "This is a drama about questioning what it means to live. If we are to accept this question, we have no choice but to, with a deep hope and determination, seek out our own spiritual world, our new type." So this is where like Saturn and Pluto come from generically, at least. Like this is what they are absolutely evoking for me. Is this sense of being in the process of transcending a physical form to become something other than human. And we see this across all sci-fi in this era as there is this longing to become more.
I think the question of how to live in Gundam, as you've just described, is equally applicable to Heaven Will Be Mine. How do the humans in space live without Earth? In order to answer that question, humanity in space must change. And that is also a question equally applicable to a group of colonized people or initially settlers who decide to break away from the motherland. So I think the more specific question in Heaven Will Be Mine is how to live without the motherland, both in the queer sense and also the colonized sense. The game implies that you have to pick a path. There is no compromise. How you are going to live is how the rest of your community is going to live. They must homogenize, which is a bit of a bittersweet argument, one that I feel betrays the spirit of the game.
I find this maybe peculiar that all three characters in all three endings end up agreeing with each other, right? Like these are characters that have been in conflict with each other across umpteen chapters, and yet in each ending, their wishes, their desires seem almost to be subsumed by the dominant like protagonist.
The very narrative is subsumed by the dominant protagonist. It doesn't matter which character you play, it matters which ending you get. There's no ending which suggests that being tolerant of another person's lifestyle is an acceptable outcome, granted because Earth exists. Because if they don't, unite, if somebody doesn't take over the gravity well, which will result in the path humanity takes. For example, Lunaterra uses the gravity well to terraform the moon, which then obliterates the ship's elves, which then forces everybody to live on the moon. Pluto, I don't remember precisely what Pluto does. I think she maybe just destroys it and then like fucks off. So, yeah, so then humanity in space is stuck in their ship selves. Saturn uses the gravity well somehow to turn them all into
He
aliens.
inverts their wave generators. For some reason, like the gravity well inverts all the wave generators in the ship selves, which produces a something like in between ship self and human. They're all like merged into those bodies, neither sort of here nor there.
And they become very, very big and very, very constellation like and completely inaccessible by the human race.
Yes, except as like a dream or something, to one day aspire to.
So to recap, the factions have to do something with the gravity well, because otherwise Earth is going to use it to enter space and bring their kinetic weapons and do like make decisions for humanity in space on the behalf of humanity in space. You can't make a decision about what to do with the gravity well without making that decision for the rest of humanity in space. I don't know if I'd call it hypocriticism, but it's close.
Yeah, it is certainly revoking everyone's agency but your own.
Is it time to piss people off and draw parallels to real life communities?
It might be. Yeah.
Okay, what do we do with the queer community that this game very, very obviously represents?
Yeah, it sort of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, doesn't it? That its seeming answer to the sort of conflict between the queerness and the status quo, right? Like its answer is like you gotta pick one and everyone's gonna do the same thing or you're screwed.
How very unqueer.
Right. Like it doesn't leave space for identities, for unique perspectives, for different ways of living and being, which is, a hallmark of queer culture, as both of us are aware.
Perhaps we could make the argument that as the queer community becomes more and more a community, it develops a culture, starts to define its culture, and starts to produce an other against which to compare itself to, perhaps the other existing within its own community. Will we stop discriminating against the furries, the truly oppressed queer class? I don't think I'm saying this ironically. I think I'm being unironic. Stop going after the furries. They're not hurting anybody.
Not just that, but like stop policing people's identities. It's been a peculiar part, right, of being on social media in the 21st century, specifically in the last 5 or 10 years, I suppose, to see both like our generation and the generation after us, and obviously like previous generations have done this too. This is nothing new. Recognizing within themselves an identity that is other, and then in order to feel comfortable or like I don't know, certain in that, they must then find something to like reflect off of or be exist in. Mm,
What makes the queer community unique is that the other that they create from within their own community is usually done so in justification of continuing to take a stand against the big bad enemy, which is out to destroy us. Namely, the colonizers, the heteronormative folks. We're trying to squash dissent within our own community, to squash the other that we recognize that we see to be a threat.
and we can see this really clearly in US politics right now with leftists and specifically like queer leftists. Not all of them, of course, not even I think the majority, but there are certainly ones arguing to like take the focus off of trans identities being persecuted by the state and basically using like the trans community as a like if we separate ourselves from them, we'll be okay. It's a way of like protecting like it, or it's
Mhm.
seen as a way to protect other queer identities when really it's just throwing the first group under the bus before all the rest of us go under the wheels, right? Like it doesn't work, but it is something that we see over and over again is like, hey, if we throw this specific group under the bus, we'll be all right.
And even within the trans community, kind of, this is going to sound weird to say, but I think it's accurate. To pass as trans, what it means to pass as trans is policed. Traditionally, the habit of the trans community to base trans identity and cis identity, wherein you're quote unquote not a real trans person if you don't look like your cis counterpart,
Yeah.
or for non-binary people, that you're quote unquote not a real non-binary person if you're not androgynous, because we can all totally control that. um, that's how a lot of queer communities, just broadly, like little sub communities, are like, this is how you have to be. Insert queer identity here, and if you don't fit that mold, then you're not a real queer.
Yeah.
Why? Because because the heteros will never accept us.
Right. It's like we need the heteronormative society to recognize us as whatever we are in order for our own self-worth to be validated. It's gross.
And then Heaven Will Be Mine is like, no, actually, fuck you. We're gonna go do our own thing. Even Lunaterra is like, fuck you. I want to be like you, but I won't be with you. But each ending requires some assimilation. It requires its own homogenized view of the future.
Yeah. So it's not quite as cynical maybe as it initially comes off as.
A lot of other reviewers view this game optimistically in its representation of the queer community. I heard this very strange echoed phrase that this game is about fitting in or how to fit in. And I'm like, it's the opposite, ma'ams. It's about not fitting in. Like deliberately going the opposite direction and saying fuck you. You can't make me
Yeah.
assimilate.
There was one essay that praised the game for envisioning queer futures, and specifically futures that are queer and not trying to exist in the shadow of a heteronormative society. But even,
Which is very anti-mecha.
yeah, even those, or even that essay undercuts it by going like, okay, but what about the settler colonialism of it all? It doesn't feel right that we are equating like trans and queer liberation to settler colonialism. It just doesn't feel like this game is thinking about it, which is largely also what we've landed on, which is that like it just doesn't feel like the focal point.
Because this game is metaphor literalized.
Yeah, it is. We love it.
Although this game isn't completely blind to the demands of environment, it does imply that however this queer community slash humanity in space develops, the community is going to have to consider environment, that they can't make the environment change. They're going to have to adapt to the environment somehow. Even Lunaterra's ending, Lunaterra picked the celestial body closest to Earth. She didn't try to terraform some other planet or moon. She's like, we're gonna go with the moon because in this game, the moon is like chemically very similar to Earth, which is not, well, I mean, it depends upon which theory you subscribe to about how the moon was created. But Lunaterra isn't doing like a dramatic terraforming. She's just pushing the moon in like a slightly different direction, and then boom, another Earth.
Yeah, there's an implication that by virtue of the moon being in close proximity to Earth, it sort of gains some of the culture of Earth. Not entirely, but like, or the moon is still close enough to Earth to actually be transformed by that in a way that the other planets are not.
And let me be specific. The theory that I'm referencing is the theory that like a meteor hit Earth a very, very long time ago and a piece of Earth fractured off and then boom, the moon. In which case, the moon would actually be a piece of Earth and would, in theory, chemically be very similar. But this game is a metaphor literalized, so I don't think it cares that much about actual science. Yeah, it cares about science in the way that I think it cares about the Cold War, in which it is a really good source of inspiration. It's not trying to represent these subjects, taking inspiration from them. Very well, I might add. It does a really good job with that.
Yeah.
It's just a little tone deaf sometimes.
It isn't always aware of what it's saying beyond the, like, central metaphor, and even that, as we've landed on, like, the endings just don't quite account for multiplicity of identity in a way that is, I feel, necessary to a game that is about queer futures.
And even the theory that goes hand in hand with any visual novel or any game with multiple endings, which is the theory that all endings are equally true, that there is no canon ending, unless the game is actually like, here's our true ending. Usually that's the ending that everybody references as the canonical ending. Heaven Will Be Mine does not have that, so in theory, all three endings are equally true. Perhaps all three endings are the existential threat, the shadow of humanity's future. Does that hurt your brain?
And to be fair to the game, while it does suggest, like, a homogeneity is necessary to live, I suppose, for these futures to come to pass. Our three characters do not become each other. They'll agree to each other's terms, they'll agree to each other's endings, but the actual characters themselves retain their characterization, and these three are not the same person by any stretch. Saturn is probably the most out there of the three, not so much in, like, she's not realistic, but in that, like, she's just the most separate from the other two. But all three of them do exist as queer identities separate from each other in different ways. I want to say two of them, is it Lunaterra and Pluto, that are both trans?
There's a text log which very, very, very strongly implies that Lunaterra is trans. I could not find similar text for Pluto, but in my research of other people's reviews and analyses, like everybody seemed to be on the same page that Pluto is also trans. I'll take it. I'll accept it. There's so much in this game that I have misread or just missed entirely because of how much bloody text there is, how much redundant text there is, that I am willing to admit that maybe I missed this
For a
part.
game that is about 6 hours long.
Could have been 3. You could actually just cut this game in half, and it would be much improved script
Yes,
wise.
it would.
Which is such a shame. There's some baller lines that are so easy to miss because you get into the habit of skimming. Because there's just so much redundant text. They needed another editor. But this is an indie
Yeah.
game. Could they afford one?
Well, they needed an editor, or they needed to separate the routes more. The routes are repeating themselves, and that's okay. In a lot of cases, you get new dialogue and such based on who you decide to, like, betray. But a lot of it is repeated, and frankly, after the, like, thousandth time seeing the word gravity.
It ceases to have any meaning.
So I want to take us to sort of my final big question, which is, like, why is this a visual novel? Why is this form best suited to the story that it's trying to tell, if it is? And also beyond budget, because I recognize that, like, visual novels are a good space for independent developers to make their mark.
I don't have a good answer, but maybe I can provide a platform off of which for you to provide a good
Woo!
answer. First of all, what is a visual novel in the gaming space? It's a piece of prose that instills a slightly greater sense of agency. There's not a lot of agency to influence the story. There's arguably none when reading a traditional piece of prose fiction or nonfiction, or watching a film or listening to a song. It's a passive act on the part of the audience. A game, however, demands agency from its player. Even if the script of a game is non negotiable, the player has to play it. They gotta do stuff, and they usually have to succeed at the game in order to progress the story. A visual novel blurs the lines between the agency required of playing a game and the passive experience of reading a book or watching a film or listening to a song. You have some agency in striving towards an ending, but your character becomes passive to the main perspective of the faction. So this game lightly plays with agency and passivity, but I don't know if the connection is strong enough for me to be confident in that argument. However, I can be slightly more confident in the mode of playing this game. You don't just make choices in this game, you can hunt down text. There's optional chat logs, there's optional text logs, and all of it, actually, I take it back, most of it are messages. They're text written out for other people to read, or text written out privately that get intercepted and then read by us, the audience. So this game is a network of communication. Communication and connection are central themes of Heaven Will Be Mine. The missions are not like shoot 'em up missions. They're not missions where you actually maneuver the characters through the mechanics of battle, even though the events of each mission is usually some kind of fight between the characters. What you're actually doing is choosing how to communicate. Those are the actual choices you make, whether the behavior that you choose or like a specific dialogue option that you use, and how you decide to communicate can lead to a way in which your characters connect before moving on to the next mission.
Yeah, I like the argument of like form and text mirror each other in certain ways. I'm gonna jump off of what you said about there not being sort of, a tactical layer. There's no actual combat system or anything like that. And what I was sort of thinking about with the visual novel format is that it does to our experience of the narrative what is being done to the pilots themselves. The actual war of it all, the actual moment to moment missions, the movements, everything that they're doing doesn't matter. And this is because we've talked about it already, but like the ship selves are toys to be like banged against each other without harm being done to the pilots or even to the mechs themselves. And so this choice to make it a visual novel seems to me in certain ways to be a reflection of that, in that like the combat is all chaff. It's all the things that can just be left behind for the conversations that happen in the middle of these battles. And again, this I think just confirms what you already said, which is like it puts a greater emphasis on communicating and closeness and like bringing these characters together over the almost mechanical factor of their life, which is like they get sent out on a mission, they do the mission, they come back. Like those things are represented, but they're not experientially important to us in the way that the moments between characters are.
Yeah, we don't care about the outcome of the fight. I think we care about the outcome of the conversation and how it is supposed to change the characters. And then you get to the endings, which don't seem to care much about any possible character growth of the player character and more the character growth of the character associated with the faction that
And
you get.
sometimes introduce characters that I was like, who are you?
Yeah, hi, Halamidi.
And Iaptis is the other one who like gets mentioned more than Halamede, to be fair, but like
And is also absent of face. Sir, where'd your face go?
and it's not even because he's one of the few men in the narratives, because whose handler or operator is there is another guy.
Mercury.
Is it Mercury? Yeah. Because at first I was like, is this are we talking about like gender here in a certain way? But no, it's just Iaptis does not get a face.
There's also a couple of nameless pilots, like men
Yeah.
pilots in Luna Terrace route, which is it feels like a massive plot hole because a lot of characters keep asserting that boys can't be pilots. I'm like, but no, just they're right there.
They're just bad at it.
I guess nobody really explains this. They just say it like a statement. Boys can't be pilots. Girls are good at being pilots.
You gotta be lesbians. Or bisexuals.
In Saturn's case, unfortunately bisexual.
I love
She's like, damn
Saturn.
it. Regrets all over.
Yeah.
Honestly, I would regret. Who wants to fuck a man with a censored face? Actually, no, that's probably somebody's kink. We don't kink shame.
But it is a space in which we're like basically introduced to characters that have not been important to the narrative or have been important but haven't been given any screen time until right at the end, which was shocking, at least on my first route, where I was like, who are you? Like, where did you come from?
Yeah, I at least got Cradle's Grace's ending first. It just concerns the three main characters because Dr. Nyx is functionally already fucked off. I don't actually know where Dr. Nyx is, but I don't think she has any character art or portrait art, so she just doesn't show up in the ending.
She was part of Cradle's Graces, not necessarily the founder of it, but she was.
She held it all together and then passed it off to Pluto, who reveals herself to be the actual leader of Cradle's Graces when everybody had assumed it was Dr. Nyx. So I don't know, maybe Dr. Nyx is dead by this point, and that Dr. Nyx's text contributions in the framework of Pluto's missions or the chapters is maybe just Pluto hallucinating Dr. Nyx.
We don't know.
That's not the point, though.
No.
What were we talking about? Endings. I think I want to lightly contradict that the combat doesn't matter. I think, mechanically speaking, it doesn't. You don't actually fight, but combat is significant because it seems to be yet another mode of communication, in part because it's communication without physical consequence. Nobody's going to die from this fight, so it seems to be a perfectly acceptable form of conversation on top of the literal conversations that the characters have before, after, and during fights.
And there's the added layer that the fights are in a lot of ways treated as foreplay. They are treated often as foreplay to a moment of intimacy between our two characters.
Whether that be physical intimacy or social intimacy, sometimes one and the same.
So there's that sort of doubling of meaning too of what this is. It's a valid form of conversation for these pilots in much the same way as we've already talked about play.
And one could argue that in Heaven Will Be Mine, it's the purest form of communication because it's the communication that is associated most closely with love. Characters fight each other because they love each other, and they love each other because they fight each other.
And how they recognize each other. I think all of them don't initially recognize each other by seeing each other's actual like countenances. They just see each other's ship selves. And in their combat, there are moments where like Lunaterra and Pluto realize who they're talking to, who they are fighting, by virtue of the ways that they express violence on each other.
And violence is the word that I want to pick up on. In Heaven Will Be Mine, love is akin to violence, even if it doesn't take on the exact forms and consequences of it. It can be violent, it can be overwhelming, it can do irreparable harm, but it can't kill you. So it's a violence without that one fatal consequence. At least love itself can't kill you. Perhaps it can lead to the circumstances which kill you, but it itself can't.
In that case, how does Heaven Will Be Mine define love?
In space, it has to adapt to the alien. Love cannot take the same forms that it does on Earth, and form in this game usually defines existence. As for what love like is, that's really hard to define. It's a lot easier to define what love looks like in Heaven Will Be Mine. But love in Heaven Will Be Mine is like any other alien human thing. It's kind of a paradox. It is, but it isn't. It exists in a in between paradoxical alien human space.
And it's a deeply mutable thing too, right? Because Celestial Mechanics ending, in which they become part of space-time, talks of the way that they continue to flirt and fight as now being defined by the celestial bodies. I wish I could find the line. I know it's in my screenshots somewhere. Sorry, I'm going to see if I can find it real quick. Yeah, here it is. Instead, they have ways of physically interfacing that aren't like anything we could imagine. Clouds of particles drift into each other. Maybe they touch through each other instead of just on the surface. It can be in a cold and gentle way, like through a ghost, or maybe a warm and gross way, like reaching into guts. Smiles communicated in physical light, an embrace of psychedelic mind matter, lazy sex in a morning bed, except the bed is the curvature of space time, and sex is something so obscene it would make your mind implode to consider it.
To add to that, can't speak or write, has other ways of communicating information, can't use the old senses, has new organs for it now. Can't love in the old ways. There are new ways of having that too. So, yeah, love is like anything else.
It is mutable and dependent on our environment.
Yeah. And bodies, and each ending supports, or well, each ending has its own take on that. We've just discussed Saturn's, well, not Saturn's ending, the Celestial Mechanics ending. The Memorial Foundation's ending is the closest to love on Earth with human bodies,
It's like a recognizable morning in bed.
with some playful banter and conflict, and Pluto being best girl per usual, getting breakfast slash coffee ready, and then letting the other two fight about it before she makes her big reveal. No, actually, I was the leader all along. No, actually, coffee was ready all along.
Yeah. Because identity, or because again, like their identities are not erased by the endings. It's just that a way of existing in opposition to Earth has been established.
And even in Pluto's ending, even though Pluto's ending, or rather this Cradle's Grace's ending, um, there are a few lines and visual depictions of life within the ship selves that they touch and communicate and are intimate with each other through their ship selves, not their physical human bodies. And that demands some change and adaptation, but not quite so dramatic change and adaptation as does the ending where they become one with the cosmos.
Are we reaching an ending ourselves?
We might be reaching an ending. Maybe a good place to end this conversation is to mention what we think, each think, is the best part of this game that actually made it worth playing if you think it was worth playing. I do.
I mean, I 100% agree. So I feel like I have two things. One is that it made me fall in love with the visual novel story, or the very visual novel format. It's not one
Oh,
that I have a ton of experience with. Yes.
sorry, not to interject. Was this baby's first visual novel?
Maybe second or third visual novel, but yeah.
Close enough.
But this is not a genre, sorry, this is not like a medium that I have a ton of experience with. Believe me, the first route, which I did, was Luna Terra's. It's not as if I found the writing annoying or difficult to parse most of the time, but I felt kind of empty afterwards. But like by the time that I completed the second, it was an immediate like, oh, I get it now, in a way that has had me hunting for other visual novels like immediately after finishing it. I think the other side of it for me is just seeing queer identities within the mech space being like fully realized as queer characters. There's no part of me that has to go like, oh, I'm going to like headcanon this or try to like, you know, yeah, actually Amuro and Char are in love. Hi Gundam fans. This is a space where like the characters are just queer and they are existing as queer people and trying to reckon with like what the future looks like for that. And I think that's really powerful, even if I'm not quite so sure that the game like pulls off its endings. Or no, not even the endings. I think the lack of choice and the lack of agency that occurs upon the characters that are not the protagonist in any given run is certainly a downfall, but I'm still glad for the experience.
For me, what made this game worth playing are two things. One, despite my strong assertion that this game could have been cut in half, this script could have been cleaned up so much, every once in a while there is a line that haunts me. But what really actually made this game worth playing and what would convince me to play it again is the soundtrack. The soundtrack is this just
Yeah.
perfect mesh of ethereal, heavenly sounds with this really grungy, sometimes, I don't know if there's any guitars, but like there's this really heavy beat in a lot of
Mhm.
songs, and they're all bangers. Like they're all really catchy, and the progression of a track through certain scenes is like orgasmic. It's great. I listened to the soundtrack afterwards, which I would strongly recommend you and anybody who picks up this game do, because there are some tracks that don't make it into the game that are also really, really good.
There's also one that might be missing from the soundtrack because, hi, yes, I have also listened to the soundtrack a couple of times now. I really love it. But there's one that's played right before the final conflict when you're having your final chat with whoever your companion is. There's something that's probably in one of the tracks, and I just missed it. But there's like a very particular, like, I think it's a guitar riff, but I'm not sure. It's so good.
And it adds so much too, especially during some of the intense battle sequences where there are supposed to be real stakes, whether they be fatal stakes or like the stake of the conflict. This is an energetic soundtrack, and energetic in so many different ways. Gets your blood pumping, gets your feelings feeling. It's gorgeous. And it's one of the reasons why visual novels have that strength over traditional prose that adds a whole layer. Like this, I would not accept this game as a novel. Where's my soundtrack?
It needs it. Yeah. I
It,
think that
yeah,
covers it.
that does. But now that we're done with Heaven Will Be Mine, we must, like the characters of the game, look to the future. What will we cover next? Well, are you ready for something completely and totally different? Let's read a book. Enough about the visual novel. Let's read a book with a completely different vibe. I suggest that we next read Orome by Balu Gurma. And the reason why I suggest we read this next is less to do with the contents of the actual novel. I did read the first couple of pages. I think it's very well written. I think I'm going to enjoy it. But there's nothing really about the premise of this novel that strikes me as exceptional, at least on the surface. However, it's the context surrounding this novel's release and the months after its release that I think makes it a worthy contender.
So, as someone who is totally uncultured and has no idea what to expect, what's the TLDR?
So, this book is based off of a series of real events where names have been changed, but this novel presents a broad account of what was called the Red Star Campaign. And the author, Balu Gurma, worked as a propaganda chief for this campaign and became disillusioned with it, and afterwards wrote this book, which, as I said, is a like loosely veiled depiction of his experiences and his conclusions about that campaign, which turned into a campaign of terror. Now, the actual book is about a love story set in the midst of the conflict. That I don't know if that's true. I don't know if Balu Gurma is supposed to be the protagonist of this love story or if he's taking inspiration from some other real person. That I don't know. I'll probably have to look into it. But what's really interesting about this book, and also tragic, is that A, it got published in the first place. It was published during a time where the military junta had a really, really strong control on all the media that was being produced, and the censorship office was just like really good at its job. So it's amazing that it got published at all because it is critical of the campaign and of the governing organization at the time. And it was actually banned like barely 24 hours after its release, but that was enough to do the damage. Some copies had already been circulated, and people were copying those copies not by hand, but like through kind of unconventional ways. And so it was like relatively famous amongst the people who could read the language of that book because it only just got translated in 2025. But what's even more interesting, and this is the tragic bit, is that after the book was published, Balu Gurma was fired, and then some months later, he disappeared. We have no idea what happened to him. It is generally believed that his disappearance was linked to the publishing of this book. It's possible that he died. It's possible that he was assassinated and then quietly disposed of. It's possible that he went into exile. We have no idea what happened to him. There's no body. And so the reason why I'm suggesting this book is not just because I think it's going to be a really good read, but because a man possibly died for this book. A book which, to my understanding, is, to the best of my understanding, not trying to disparage the regime, but is trying to present honest criticism of it. There's already a weight to this book that makes it worth checking out, at the very least.
Yeah.
No lesbians, as far as I know, so totally different. I hope there are lesbians.
It feels wrong to say, that sounds fantastic given the context, but I am excited to read this, though I am devastated that I have to buy a hard cover copy of it.
It's what Balu Gurma deserves.
So look forward to Orome in our next episode.
Get hyped, get sad. Mixture of feelings all around.